archaeologists dig, a tourist site. These stones behind me were the foundation of Solomon's massive gates. To build these fortifications, the whole network of citadels guarding the capital and the major trade routes, he resorted to a device of bitter memory, forced labor. To man these garrisons, he fell back on another drastic measure, military conscription. The imperial style could be supported only by a heavy burden of new taxes. This fell crushingly on the ordinary people, the small farmers and tradesmen.
Around the year 920, after Solomon's death, rival claims to the throne erupted. The empire fell apart and the kingdom split in two, Israel in the north, with a capital of its own, Judah in the south, holding on to Jerusalem and the Holy Temple, two states going their separate ways. The Israelites had come a long way from their simple beginnings. The egalitarian life of the early settlements had been corrupted by power and affluence. In a society ruled by rank and privilege, who would speak for the ordinary people?
You trample upon the poor and take from them exactions of wheat. You have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them.
These were the words of a shepherd named Amos. Amos, spelling out the symptoms of Israel's plight. Farmers and tradesmen forced into debt. A rising class of rich landowners collaborating with corrupt judges, exploiting their neighbors' distress.
Listen to this, you who would devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, tilting a dishonest scale and selling grain refuse as grain. The Lord swears by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget any of their doings.
In the 8th century, as inequities worsened and society disintegrated, the cry for social justice was taken up by other inspired dissidents. Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, the men we have come to know as the prophets. Some were imprisoned for their dissent. They preached against foreign alliances, against the spread of foreign cults. The prophets spoke as caretakers of the religion, recalling the Israelites to their origins, recalling them to God's law.
Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Justice and righteousness. The absence of justice was nothing less than a violation of the covenant that was Israel's foundation, the heritage of Sinai. A terrible retribution was promised.
You princes of the house of Israel, who hate the good and love the evil, because of you shall Zion be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem become rubble.
In fact, the danger was not far off. Egypt and Mesopotamia were stirring again, the empire of the pharaohs being challenged by a dynamic military force from Assyria. In the course of this conflict, the northern kingdom of Israel was reduced to a vassal state, surviving only by paying tribute to the Assyrians. Then it was simply swept up into the empire. A century later, the armies of Babylon came marching west and in 605 defeated the Egyptians. Judah was occupied by the Babylonians under King Nebuchadnezzar. Jerusalem was pillaged. At least 10,000 families were sent into exile. The temple was destroyed by fire.
How the city does sit solitary that was full of people. She that was great among the nations, how she has become a vassal. Judah is gone into exile. She dwells among the heathen. She finds no rest.
The year was 586 before the Common Era, one of the bitterest years in Jewish memory. The life of the independent nation was ended. Its unifying symbol, the temple, was in ruins. The leadership in exile in Babylon. In this majestic city of perhaps 1 million people, more than 500 miles from ruined Jerusalem, a group of Hebrew scribes set about organizing and assimilating their people's history. This is where they assembled the law, written and spoken, the writings and sayings of their leaders, poets and prophets, assembled it into the first books of the Bible, into their great national work, the Torah.
What emerged in this book, these books, what had been emerging over the centuries, from the Exodus to the exile, was a new and larger vision of life. In the tragedy that had overtaken them, the exiles saw the hand of a universal God. Had not the prophets warned them that violating the covenant would bring on a terrible punishment? Was it not their God, Yahweh, who had sent the mightiest empires of the world to punish the Israelites? So Israel and the enemies that had brought about its downfall were all the instruments of a single God and his universal law, a law in which goodness was required and in which wrongdoing was doomed to failure. All the world's nations were linked in a common destiny, bound together by a moral law with inescapable consequences. At the center of this vision was no mere God of nature, but the God of all history, no mere national God, but the God of all mankind. The exiled people who wrote that vision into their history were called Yehudim, people of Judah. The word became Jews. In the experience of exile, the vision of the early Israelites was transformed, and the Jewish people was born. Born, they believed, to a chosen mission, to carry the word of the single God of justice and mercy from this place, Jerusalem, to carry the word through history.
And on that day, says the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation.
In the morning of their long exile, the people of Israel saw the words of their prophets fulfilled.
Both husband and wife shall be taken, the old folk and the very aged. Their houses shall be turned over to others, for I will stretch out my hand against the inhabitants of the land.
In the year 586 before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylonia, destroyed Jerusalem and burned the temple, the holiest place of the Jewish people and the center of their worship. In this tragedy, the prophets of Israel saw a divine purpose. Their people had violated the sacred laws of their God, and they had been punished. But now, if they returned to the ways of the law, they could win forgiveness. This was the promise of their God, according to the prophets.
I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation shall reach to the end of the earth.
Thousands were exiled from Judah to Babylon, the land of their conquerors. It could have been the end of the Jewish story, but instead it was only the beginning. The people of Judah had been humbled by the sword. They were now to rely upon something more powerful than the sword, an idea, and the words that express it. In the land of exile, in the far country of the two great rivers, Nebuchadnezzar was king. His chief city, Babylon, was his attempt at immortality. It was the cultural capital of the world. What the Jewish exiles discovered here would have a far greater impact on history than all the glories of this city now in ruins. In a sense, they discovered their very identity.
Exiled from their homeland, threatened with extinction as a people, they resisted and ultimately transformed themselves. In the centuries following the destruction of their temple, the Jews would live under the domination of different peoples and different cultures, Persians, Greeks, Egyptians, Romans. Through every trial, they would survive, preserving their identity as a people. They understood that upon their survival depended the survival of their revolutionary ideas about God and about the purpose of human existence. They were embarking upon a long and harrowing journey.
The story began in the most voluptuous city in the world, where the desert blossomed and teemed with life, a sort of paradise. In this place, the Jews came to believe more profoundly than ever before that there was a universal dimension to their faith, that the dominion of their God extended to all lands, to all time. And yet in their exile, the Jews still yearned for what they had lost.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her coming. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth.
Torn from their homeland, the Jews now had to face the unfamiliar. Strange religions, strange customs, and a strange and wonderful city. Babylon the Great, it was called, the center and the envy of the civilized world. In remote regions of Iraq and in mud brick cities of Morocco, there is an image today of that once great place. Babylon was a crossroads where cultures met and ideas metamorphosed. It was an Oriental city, fond of subtleties. The exile had sent the Jews all over the Near East into Egypt and Asia Minor, but principally to Babylonia, and there they settled. Babylonia was the direct heir of ancient Mesopotamia, where laws had first been codified and time divided into hours and minutes. Within Babylonia, there were linguists, mathematicians, astronomers, and physicians. In most ways, it was a nourishing climate for the Jewish exiles. Portions of the Great Gate of Babylon survive today, a gate dedicated to Ishtar, Queen of Heaven. Its richly tiled walls, covered with beasts, real and imaginary, confronted anyone who entered this city. In this land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Jews followed their familiar pursuits. The words of the prophet Jeremiah in a letter to the exiles established a principle by which they would live.
Thus says the God of Israel to all the exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them. Take wives and have sons and daughters. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare.
It was here in Babylon that they began to forge their character as a people. It was here that Judaism was born. God had once been worshipped through the temple sacrifices of the priests. Now he would be worshipped by individuals, by the people in their way of life. They sanctified the smallest details of life, thus creating a Jewish identity that would grow and develop to this very day. The portions of dough once reserved for the priests of the temple were still set aside, though the priestly duties had ceased, for there was no temple. Their traditions defined the foods they could eat, defined the way those foods must be prepared. They limited themselves to those that were proper according to sacred law, that were fit. The Hebrew word was kasher, kosher. In preparing meat, they were scrupulous in removing all blood, removing it in the way the animal was killed, removing it afterwards by repeated salting and washing. In 100 ways, in the food they ate, in their ceremonies of purification, of circumcision, of blessing, they reinforced their separate identity. In remaining separate, they guarded their belief in their universal God and his laws. It was in Babylon that Jewish scribes compiled the writings they had brought from Judah, the history, the laws, the legends of the Jewish people, and combined them with what had been passed down by word of mouth to form the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Babylon was to remain a home of the Jews for centuries. But in the end, all its ingenious and immense constructions crumbled into desert dust. What the Jews had nurtured there, their beliefs and their unity as a people, survived. Toward the end of the 6th century, barely 2 generations after the Jews had arrived captive in Babylon, Cyrus the Persian absorbed the land into his empire. Under Cyrus and his successors, the Persian Empire spread across the Fertile Crescent until it encompassed all of Media and Babylonia and reached towards its rival Greece. The kings of Persia enjoyed great pomp in life and in death. They carved their tombs into the shoulders of mountains and massed great cities on their plains. Persepolis, where they harnessed captive kings to their chariots. Its palace was perhaps the most beautiful building in the ancient world. To restore order in their vast domain, the Persian kings allowed exiled peoples to return home. Cuneiform records show that the imperial treasury was turned to reconstructing cities and temples throughout the empire. In the Jewish memory, the Persian kings seemed the bearers of divine forgiveness.
Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, "The Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth. Whoever is among you of his people, let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord."
Many had grown accustomed to life in Babylonia. Many stayed on in what would remain the largest Jewish community outside Judah. But others, the hopeful, the dedicated, headed towards the Holy Land, headed toward a place that had lived on in their dreams as the land of milk and honey. The first of them arrived at the walls of Jerusalem in the year 538 before the Common Era. The reality of what they found was harsh. Jerusalem had been torn asunder. Their fields had lain fallow for years. Its buildings in ruins, its walls broken, their city lay defenseless. Years of hardship stretched before them. The final task of rebuilding was completed almost a century later by a Jewish noble at the Persian court. He was Nehemiah, a patriot of deep religious conviction. The Persians placed Nehemiah in authority over Jerusalem. He brought order to the city and rebuilt its defenses. The Jews had recovered their ancient home.
Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the lands. Come into his presence with singing. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him. Bless his name.
In Babylon, the Jewish religion had become the property of the people, a faith preserved and cherished by every individual. Home now in Judah, the Jews were still subject to an alien rule. They needed something of their own, which would bind them forever to their God.
That something was the law. It arrived in Jerusalem from Babylon in the hands of Ezra the scribe. He brought with him the code of law that the scholars had edited in Babylon, the Torah. It is said that Ezra brought the people together in solemn assembly and read them the book of the law.
Within the Torah, the first books of the Bible, were set out the marriage customs, property laws, the ethical standards, the civil regulations, and the religious requirements of the Jews. Each individual could now judge his own acts, for the sacred law was written down and available to everyone.
Written down, it was made permanent. It endowed the people of Judah with the cohesiveness that would enable them to restore themselves. It would help them preserve their faith against
Farmers and tradesmen forced into debt, a rising class of rich landowners collaborating with corrupt judges, exploiting their neighbors' distress.
Listen to this, you who would devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, tilting a dishonest scale and selling grain refuse as grain. The Lord swears by the pride of Jacob, I will never forget any of their doings.
In the 8th century, as inequities worsened and society disintegrated,
it fell crushingly on the ordinary people, the small farmers and tradesmen.
Around the year 920, after Solomon's death, rival claims to the throne erupted. The empire fell apart and the kingdom split in two. Israel in the north, with a capital of its own, Judah in the south, holding on to Jerusalem and the Holy Temple. Two states going their separate ways. The Israelites had come a long way from their simple beginnings. The egalitarian life of the early settlements had been corrupted by power and affluence. In a society ruled by rank and privilege, who would speak for the ordinary people?
You trample upon the poor and take from them exactions of wheat. You have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not live in them.
These were the words of a shepherd named Amos. Amos, spelling out the symptoms of Israel's plight.
Archaeologists dig, a tourist site. These stones behind me were the foundation of Solomon's massive gates. To build these fortifications, the whole network of citadels guarding the capital and the major trade routes, he resorted to a device of bitter memory, forced labor. To man these garrisons, he fell back on another drastic measure, military conscription. The imperial style could be supported only by a heavy burden of new taxes.
The cry for social justice was taken up by other inspired dissidents. Hosea, Micah, Isaiah, the men we have come to know as the prophets. Some were imprisoned for their dissent. They preached against foreign alliances, against the spread of foreign cults. The prophets spoke as caretakers of the religion, recalling the Israelites to their origins, recalling them to God's law.
Take away from me the noise of your